The primary factor that determines what type of biome an area will be is the climate of the area. And then there are other factors also, but climate is the main one. And in this lecture, we'll also talk briefly about the concept of succession and how when an area is disturbed by a wildfire, for example, or other disturbance, how the biome will change over time because of new plants coming into an area. So the climate, we said, is the primary factor that predicts the biome of a region. And within climate, the primary factor, climatic factor, is precipitation that determines what biome you're in. On this chart here, I've ranked the biomes in terms of the highest to the lowest rainfall levels for each biome. And basically, I want you to notice that there's kind of three main categories. There's the top two biomes, which receive fairly high levels of precipitation. The three middle biomes receive fairly moderate levels of precipitation, and the bottom two receive very low levels of precipitation. So tropical and deciduous forests receive high levels. Grassland, coniferous forest, and shrublands receive moderate levels, and tundra and desert receive low levels of rainfall. So what makes something a tundra versus a desert, or what makes something grassland versus coniferous forest if they receive the same amount of precipitation? Well, some of that is moderated by the soil or the slope of the land, but the secondary factor that's the most critical within climate is the temperature effect. So temperature effects are superimposed on top of the precipitation effects, and they influence the biome that a region will be if it has similar levels of rainfall. So for an example here, there are three different types of forests that receive about 30 inches or slightly more of rainfall per year. That's tropical rainforests, deciduous forests, and coniferous forests. So within these tropical rainforests, there are some that have very broad-leafed evergreen trees. So these are trees that stay green all year. They don't drop their leaves, but they're very big, broad leaves, and these leaves cannot tolerate freezing. So this area might only receive 40 inches of rainfall per year, but it stays warm year-round, and so that determines that it's a tropical rainforest. Coniferous forest, they have very harsh winters and short summers, and so even though they receive 35 inches of rainfall a year, you have to have trees there that can tolerate these really long winters and that spread their seeds through cones instead of flowers, because the flowers might get harmed by late frosts. And then of course deciduous trees, those kind of lie right in the middle. They can survive winter, but they need longer summers in order to leaf out and develop and grow. Okay, so another example, if we're talking about the low precipitation levels, if we compare two biomes that have low precipitation, that would be the tundra biome and the desert biome. Tundra biomes, we said, have grass, clover, and other small plants that can grow on permafrost. And again, permafrost is soil that stays frozen year-round. It typically has a couple inches at the very top of the soil profile where the soil does thaw out in the summer. And because the soil that's thawed is so shallow, trees really can't get established in permafrost and in tundra biomes. Desert biomes are different. They get less precipitation than most, just like a tundra, so they get the same amount of precipitation, but evaporation rates in warm deserts are very high because of the hot temperatures and low humidity. And they don't have permafrost, so plants can put roots deeper into the soil, and so you're going to have very different plant species growing here. You do get trees, but again, they're not big leafy trees because it's too hot and dry, and they would have big leaves would lead to too much evaporation from the plant. So you tend to have these similarly scrubby looking kind of trees with little leaves on them, and they're not particularly very green. So that is similar to the tundra. Another effect that we see in addition to precipitation and temperature would be the effect of latitude and altitude on the biome. And these are important, of course, as you travel further away from the equator. It tends to be colder, so that's also a temperature effect. And as you travel up in elevation from sea level, it tends to be colder. So basically, as you go to this end of the chart here, these are colder areas than the bottom left-hand corner, where we have very warm, lush jungles. So as you travel further from the equator, you go from tropical rainforest to temperate deciduous forest to coniferous forest, and then tundra is at the very furthest area from the equator, but it's not necessarily very high in sea level, and so it's kind of in the middle here. It's you can have tundra that's very close to sea level, all the way up to a few thousand feet above sea level. We talk about biomes as these large regions, so big ecosystem regions on Earth, but we do find areas that have microclimates, and so within a microclimate you might have a very small area that looks like that biome has been misplaced. So you might say, wow, this is a little mini ecosystem within a larger ecosystem. And that happens whenever you have a microclimate. And a microclimate is any kind of specialized condition, specialized climate area within a larger biome area. So an example, here we see a picture of a river flowing through a desert. So along this river system, you can have a little microsystem where you get different trees growing because they can extract water from the river. We also see if there's different soil types, that can affect a biome, because different vegetation can grow in different soil types. So if you have soils that have a lot of clay, they're going to hold on to a lot of water, and then plants that like water can grow in those. Whereas if you have a rocky soil, it's not going to hold on to a lot of water, and so plants that don't like to have really wet roots are going to grow there. The slope of the land matters because soil can't get established if the slope's too steep, and so that impacts what plants are able to grow there. And then even if you've driven ever through a mountain region in the spring, you might notice that the side facing the sun of the mountain, all the snow will have melted and it'll start to be green, whereas the other side might still have a few inches of snow if it's facing away from the sun. And so north versus south facing, or facing the sun, not facing the sun, will make a big difference on a mountain. So here's a classic example of a mountain, the island of Hawaii. And on this big island of Hawaii, we see that one side of the island is very lush and green, and the other side is much more like a desert. And that's because the moisture tends to come from this side of the island, and then it hits this big tall mountain. It's hard to tell from this picture that that's a tall mountain, but this volcano is very tall. And so when the moisture hits this mountain, it drops all of the water onto the side of the island that it encounters first, and then those dry clouds go over the island, and then the other side of the island receives very little precipitation. So that would be an example, of a microclimate. So another discussion about biomes and how they might change over time or might be different from what you'd expect has to do with disturbances. So ecosystems can experience a disturbance that would change what plant life is able to be there. So for example, if there's a wildfire that comes through, it's going to burn up the vegetation in the area, or if there's a pollution event, or if bulldozers come and clear the land to put in a field of crops, then that would disturb the landscape. But then over time, that landscape can return to its previous conditions, but it depends on how resilient the landscape is and also how harsh the disturbance was. This process we call ecological succession. The first step in ecological succession, so you can imagine if wildfires come through and destroyed everything, you just have bare soil and bare rocks. And so the first step is that moss will begin to grow on the bare rock and soil surfaces. This helps to generate soil development and the development of soil horizons. And then the next step would be called secondary succession. That's where plant life begins to grow. So you get grasses first, followed by pines, and then hardwood trees if you're talking about a deciduous forest. And then once these plants start to grow, animals can return. So animals can't return until there's something for them to eat. We need something at the base of our, in our trophic levels, we need the producers in order for the consumers to survive. So I like charts. So here we see the progression of succession over time. So again, first you're going to get some annual plants and grasses, then shrubs can start to grow, then smaller softwood pine trees that grow a little faster, and then finally the slow-growing trees will eventually come back. So that is the timeline for succession. So it's mostly just important that you kind of remember this timeline and what's going to be first, second, third, and really it's not important to know how long. We're just going to talk about in terms of generalities.